Hey friends, sometimes we spend so much time learning how to move through the world in ways that keep us connected, accepted, or safe that we stop noticing how much effort it takes to hold these patterns in place. Not because we're pretending to be someone else, but because adaptation can become so familiar that it simply starts to feel like who we are. Over time, you learn what parts of yourself feel easier to offer, what reactions feel safer to hide, and what ways of showing up seems helpful to maintain belonging in the spaces that matter to you. And most of that learning doesn't happen consciously. It happens slowly through relationships, experiences, disappointments, responsibilities, and the subtle moments where you begin to understand what feels welcomed is what feels risky. Eventually, those way Eventually, those ways of moving through life can feel so natural that you may not even recognize them as adaptations anymore. They may just become part of how you function, part of how you relate, and part of how you stay connected to the people around you. But underneath all of that, there's still a real person who has never been lost. And I think one of the gentlest truths in healing is realizing that God has never confused the adaptations with the person beneath them. He's never mistaken your usefulness for your identity. He's never loved you only through the parts that you learned how to survive well, or stay steady, stay needed, or stay small enough to keep belonging intact. He's always seen the whole you, not just the version shaped around expectations or roles or the quiet ways you learn to move carefully through relationships, but the deeper self underneath all of it. The self that may still be learning what it means to feel safe enough to be fully present and fully known at the same time. And that's where I want us to begin today. Not by trying to pull ourselves apart to examine every layer, but simply by resting for a moment in the possibility that God's love has never depended on how well you learn to adapt. And as we sit with that, I want to bring a passage that has steadied people for generations precisely because it speaks to being fully known without fear. In Psalms 139, David writes, "Lord, you have searched me and known me." And there is something deeply grounding about the order of those words. Known, not evaluated first, not measured first, not loved conditionally after proving something, but known. The psalm goes on to describe a God who is present in every part of a person's life, aware of the thoughts before they are fully formed, and familiar with every movement and a season. It paints a picture of a knowing that is not distant or observational, but deeply personal and steady. There's no sense in the passage that God is only near the polished or understandable parts of a person. His knowing extends into the places that are hidden, unfinished, uncertain, and still becoming. That matters because many of us quietly assume that the parts of ourselves that developed in response to fear, pressure, expectation, or the need to belong somehow make us less fully ourselves. We can begin to think of those layers as evidence that we have drifted too far from who we were meant to be, or that God's nearness depends on how quickly we sort through them and become more whole. But Psalm 139 does not describe a God who loses sight of us once we're inside our complexity. It describes a God who remains fully present within it. There's another place in Scripture that carries the same steadiness. In Isaiah 43, God says, "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name, and you are mine." There's such tenderness in being called by name, not by usefulness, not by performance, not by the role you learn to fill in order to stay connected or needed, by name. And the passage continues with promises of presence through waters, rivers, and fire. Not promises that difficulty will never exist, but reassurance that God does not step away from us inside of it. His closeness is not dependent on how composed we are or how clearly we understand ourselves. It remains steady even while we're still healing, still growing, and still learning how to live more honestly and to rest. And there's also a quiet comfort in the words from Epistle to the Romans 8, where it says that we have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but a spirit of adoption. That language feels important here because adoption speaks to belonging that is rooted in relationship rather than performance. It speaks to being claimed, welcomed, and held as family, not because you managed yourself perfectly, but because love chose you first. And when the passages begin to settle together, they create a different picture of identity than the one many of us carry quietly. An identity that is not dependent on how useful you are, not dependent on how carefully you manage yourself, not dependent on how well you learn to adapt, but rooted instead in being fully known and still fully loved. I think one of the quieter challenges in life is that adaptation often becomes so familiar we stop recognizing it as adaptation at all. What once began as a way of staying connected, avoiding conflict, or protecting something tender gradually settles into the rhythm of daily life until it simply feels normal. And you learn how to anticipate what others need, how to move carefully through certain conversations, or how to present the parts of yourself that feel easiest for others to receive. Excuse me. And because those patterns can help relationships feel steadier or safer, they rarely appear harmful on the surface. In many ways, they often look admirable. They can look like kindness, dependability, flexibility, maturity, or selflessness. And sometimes those quiet qualities are genuinely present within them. But over time, there can also be a subtle exhaustion that develops when too much of your life has shaped around maintaining connection through carefulness. Not always an obvious exhaustion, but the kind that settles quietly into the body and mind until you hardly notice how much energy it takes to remain adjusted all the time. What makes this difficult to untangle is that adaptation is rarely born from a desire to be false. And people are not consciously trying to hide who they are. More often, they are trying to respond to what felt necessary in the environments that shaped them. Certain responses felt safer. Certain emotions were easier to tuck away. Certain ways of showing up seemed to preserve closeness, reduce tension, or protect belonging. And over time, those responses became so practiced that they started to feel inseparable from the identity itself. That can create a confusing kind of grief in seasons of healing. Because as you begin to notice those patterns more clearly, you may also realize how difficult it is to tell where your adaptation ends or where your truest self begins. There can be moments where you wonder which reactions are deeply you and which were learned through years of trying to stay connected, needed, or emotionally safe. That uncertainty can feel vulnerable, especially if you've spent much of your life being known primarily through the roles that you filled for others. And yet, even inside that uncertainty, there's something deeply reassuring about the truth that none of this is unfamiliar to God. He is not trying to separate the real you from the adapted you with frustration or disappointment. He has always seen the full picture at once. He understands every layer of your story, every place where tenderness shaped caution, and every way that you learn to move through the world in order to remain connected and safe. That means your healing is not happening while God stands at a distance, waiting for you to become more authentic before He draws closer. His presence has already been with you inside every version that you've carried. The parts of you that feel strong, the parts that feel tired, the places where you feel grounded, and the places where you still feel uncertain. None of them exist outside of His compassion. And maybe that matters more than we realize. Because when people begin to notice the ways that they adapted over time, there can sometimes be a temptation to turn that awareness into self-criticism, as though every survival pattern is evidence that they have somehow failed to become who they were supposed to be. But gentleness grows differently than that. Healing grows different than that. It grows in spaces where a person feels safe, where a person begins to feel safe enough to be honest without fear that honesty will remove their belonging. And perhaps that is part of what God's presence has been offering all along. Not pressure to become someone else overnight, but the steady reassurance that you are already loved while you are still learning how to rest more fully in who you are. As that truth begins to settle in, even slowly, it can change the way you approach the process of healing itself. When you no longer believe that God's love depends on how quickly you untangle every part or understand every layer of yourself, there is a little more room to move through growth without so much fear being attached to it. The process becomes less about proving who you really are, or or that you're finally doing it right, and more about learning how to live with increasing honesty and rest. That kind of shift matters because many people quietly carry a pressure to become whole as efficiently as possible, even when they would never say that out loud. There can be an internal urgency beneath the surface, a feeling that healing should happen faster, a clarity that should come sooner, or the harder parts of themselves should already be resolved by now. And when that expectation settles in deeply enough, growth can begin to feel less like unfolding and more like a constant evaluation of whether enough progress has been made. But real healing rarely moves that way. Most of the time, it unfolds gradually through repeated experiences of safety, steadiness, honesty, and grace. It happens in small moments that do not always feel dramatic while they are occurring. A person notices they no longer tense in a conversation the way that they once did. They recognize that they expressed a need without apologizing for it. They realize that they rested without feeling responsible for everyone else's emotions first. Often those moments are quiet enough to miss if you're only looking for transformation and large visible breakthroughs. And maybe that's important to remember because when growth happens slowly, it can be easy to assume nothing is meaningful is changing. But slowness does not mean absence. In many cases, the deepest healing happens gradually enough that it feels almost ordinary while it's taking place. I think that's especially true when it comes to learning that your belonging with God is not fragile. For many people, belonging in relationship has felt connected to usefulness, emotional steadiness, or the ability to meet expectations consistently. When that has been the pattern for long enough, it can become difficult to manage a form of love that remains steady without requiring constant management in return. And yet the love of God continues to move toward us with steadiness that is not dependent on emotional performance. His nearness does not increase when we appear more put together. It does not diminish when we feel unsure, tired, guarded, or still in process. He is not relating to a curated version of you. He is relating to the whole person underneath every layer that has developed over time. That does not mean that those layers are meaningless. Many of them carried you through seasons where you were doing the best you could with what you understood at the time. There is compassion being held even for the ways you learned to protect yourself. But compassion is different from performance. Compassion is different from permanence. In fact, the fact that a pattern once helped you survive does not mean that you're required to live inside of that forever. And perhaps that's where healing slowly becomes less frightening. Not because you're forcing yourself to tear every protective layer away at once, but because you are beginning to trust that God's love will remain steady even as you become more honest within it. Little by little, you start to realize that you do not have to earn safety before you can rest. You do not have to perform usefulness before you can belong. You do not have to stay small in order to remain loved. That kind of realization often arrives quietly. It settles into the heart over time through repeated encounters with grace that does not pull away when you are still becoming. And maybe that is part of what makes God's presence so healing. It creates a space for a person to unfold honestly without fear that honesty itself will cost them connection. When a person begins to experience that kind of steadiness from God, something very gentle starts to shift over time. Not usually all at once, and not in a way that suddenly removes every old instinct or protective response, but in a quieter way that gradually changes how safe it feels to simply exist without so much management. There can be moments where you notice yourself relaxing in ways that you did not expect. Moments where you speak honestly without rehearsing every possible reaction beforehand, or where you allow yourself to rest without feeling responsible for holding everything together first. At first, those moments can feel small, almost easy to dismiss, but often they are signs that something deeper is changing underneath the surface. Because when love no longer feels conditional, the nervous system slowly stops preparing for rejection in the same ways. And when belonging no longer feels dependent on usefulness, there's less pressure to constantly prove your place through effort, attentiveness, or emotional caretaking. That does not mean old patterns disappear immediately. Many of them were practiced for years, and practiced things rarely loosen overnight. But repeated experiences of steadiness begin to create a different internal environment, one where honesty feels less dangerous and presence feels more possible. I think that's part of why Scripture speaks so often about abiding, remaining, dwelling, and resting in God's love. Those words carry a sense of staying somewhere long enough for your heart to believe it is safe there. They describe a relationship that is not built on performance or constant striving, but on continued nearness. And for people who learn to move carefully in order to preserve belonging, that kind of nearness can feel both comforting and unfamiliar at the same time. There is often a tenderness in learning that you do not have to monitor yourself constantly in order to remain loved. You do not have to calculate how much of yourself is acceptable before you enter God's presence. You do not have to make yourself smaller, steadier, easier, or more useful before He welcomes you close. The invitation of God has always been towards relationship with the real person underneath every adaptation, not just the version that you learned to survive well. And perhaps that's why healing often unfolds more honestly in the presence of compassion than in the presence of pressure. Pressure usually makes people tighten, hide, or perform. Compassion creates room for breath. It creates room for a person to notice what has been carried for a long time without immediately feeling condemned for carrying it. In that kind of environment, growth begins to happen with less fear attached to it. That does not mean that the process is easy. There will always be moments where the old instincts rise up quickly, moments where the familiar patterns feel easier than vulnerability, and moments where it feels safer to retreat into the version of yourself that once kept relationships steady. But even there, God is not startled by the process. He is not withdrawing His presence every time you struggle to live differently than you once did. His love remains steady through all of it. And maybe that is what allows healing to happen slowly and honestly instead of forcefully. It happens within the security of knowing that you are already fully seen and fully loved, even while parts of you are still learning what it means to live from that truth. As you sit with all of this, there is no need to start sorting through every layer of yourself tonight. You don't have to peel back every piece of the onion. You do not have to analyze every pattern or figure out exactly where each response came from in order to receive the comfort of being fully known by God. This is not an invitation into self-examination for the sake of fixing yourself. It is simply an invitation to notice where you may still be carrying the quiet belief that love depends on how well you manage yourself. You may recognize places where the usefulness has felt closely connected to belonging, or moments where you instinctively make yourself smaller, steadier, easier, or more emotionally careful in order to preserve connection. You may notice how natural it feels to remain attentive to the needs of others while struggling to believe that your own presence is enough apart from what you provide. And none of that needs to be met with shame. These patterns often form slowly over time, shaped by environments and experiences that taught you what felt safe or most welcomed. But perhaps there's another possibility beginning to open in front of you. Perhaps healing does not begin with becoming someone entirely different, but with slowly trusting that God already sees and loves the person underneath every layer that you learn to carry. Perhaps growth becomes gentler when it is no longer driven by fear that honesty will cost you belonging. And maybe that leads to a quieter kind of question, one that is less about solving yourself and more about allowing yourself to be seen. Where in my life do I still feel pressure to earn belonging through usefulness, carefulness, or emotional performance? And what would it look like to believe that God already loves the real person underneath those patterns? As we move into prayer, you do not need to come with perfect clarity or fully formed understanding. You can simply come as you are, carrying whatever feels tender, tired, uncertain, or unfinished. God, thank you for knowing us more fully than we know ourselves. Thank you that your love does not depend on how well we manage our emotions, meet expectations, or hold everything together. Thank you that you see beyond every layer we learn to carry and still move toward us with steadiness, compassion, and care. For the places in us that learn to adapt in order to feel safe, would you bring gentleness instead of shame? Help us to recognize that you are not disappointed by the ways that we learned to survive difficult or complicated moments. You have been present through every season of our lives, and your love has remained steady through all of it. Would you slowly teach our hearts what it feels like to belong without performance? Teach us what it means to rest in being loved apart from usefulness, apart from emotional steadiness, apart from how carefully we manage ourselves in relationships. Help us believe that your nearness is not fragile and that we do not have to earn our place with you. And where healing still feels slow, please give us patience with the process. Remind us that growth does not have to be forced in order to be real. Help us become more honest, more present, and more at rest in your love over time, without fear that you will pull away while we are still becoming. Thank you for seeing the whole of us and remaining near. Amen. As you move into the rest of your week, may you carry with you the quiet reassurance that you do not have to perform your way into belonging. May you feel little by little the steadiness of being loved apart from usefulness, apart from emotional carefulness, and apart from the many ways that you have learned to adapt over time. May you experience increasing freedom to rest in the truth that God already sees the real person underneath every protective layer, and that his love has never depended on how well you held yourself together. And where old instincts rise up, may you meet yourself with the same gentleness and patience that God continually extends towards you. May healing unfold slowly, honestly, and safely within the steadiness of his presence. And may you continue discovering that you are not loved for the version of yourself that has learned how to survive best, but for the deeply known and deeply loved person you have always been in the sight of God. If this resonated, you might also want to sit with episode 24, How Childhood Shapes the Way You See Yourself. It explores the quiet ways early belonging, expectations, and relational patterns can shape identity over time, and how healing invites us back toward honesty, steadiness, and selfhood. Or devotional 22, when peace feels unfamiliar. If you spent a long time adapting in order to maintain connection or safety, this devotional gently explores what it means to rest in the steadier peace of God. And devotional 12, Faithfulness Without Pressure. If you've been carrying the weight of needing to hold everything together, it may help you sit more gently with grace and belonging. Thanks for spending this time with me today. If this devotional met you somewhere tender, I want you to know that there is space to continue exploring these themes slowly and honestly. You can find companion guides, devotionals, a guided path through the Healer and Hope Giver ecosystem at healerandhopegiver.com, where everything is designed to help you move at your own pace and engage in these conversations in a way that feels steady and supportive. There is also the Stay Connected link at the bottom of the homepage, where you can get signed up for our weekly encouragement emails and get lots of fun extras that are not part of our episodes every week. So that's an option as well if you want to get connected there. And if this episode resonated with you, one of the simplest ways you can help someone else find this space is by sharing it. You never know who may need the reminder that they are also loved beyond the roles that they are learned to carry. If you haven't already, you can follow the podcast wherever you listen, so the Monday conversations and the Thursday devotionals continue showing up in a rhythm each week. And if YouTube is an easier place for you to listen or revisit episodes, you can find everything there as well. And even a lot of shorts that are not part of our other ecosystems as well. And if something in this episode stayed with you, I'd genuinely love to hear about that. You can always message me through social media or through the website. I read every single message. So many future conversations begin because someone was honest enough to share what resonated, what felt difficult, or what felt unfinished and needs more exploration. We'll continue together on Monday with the next long-form episode and then meet back here again next Thursday. And until next time, may you rest a little more deeply in the truth that you are already fully known and fully loved.